Peace, y'all. It is I, the Emma, Energy Master Allah, and you are watching the Leopard in the Mirror, Canticle of the Mutant Guardian lecture series. If you don't have the book Leopard in the Mirror, you can grab that on Amazon. Yes, you grab that physical. Pages. Real pages. Yeah. All right, we are on episode 24. This is Book 3, The Return of Understanding, and we are in Canto XXII, Victory, the Winnowing of Light. Now, as always, I record these live on Facebook first, and then I upload them onto YouTube. So if you are watching on YouTube right now, go ahead, like, subscribe, do all of that if you haven't already. And we are going to go ahead and jump into it. First, I will read the canto, then we will go through it. How about that? All right. Canto 22, Victory, the Winnowing of Light. In the silence, hold on. Let me get it right. Make sure it's scrolling like I like. There we go. In the silence between pulses, the grain remembers the hand that cast it. Buried in the loam of forgetting, each seed whispers, separation is the beginning of return. The blind man touches the wall and feels the architecture of the infinite. The deaf man listens through the bones of the earth. The dumb man signs in the marrow of the stars. When all three speak in one tongue, that is victory. From the granary of Dogon time, the beams of being are sifted. The winnower's fan hums the parable of plasma, each husk falling to shadow, each kernel rising to flame. The sieve is the mind of God, and the dust that escapes is the story we call matter. So was the Christ raised, not from death but from density. His bones were sieves of light, his blood an algebra of photons pressing against the veil. The falling eagle turns in slow parabola, its feathers tracing Fibonacci spirals across the breadth of Vega. Once it nested in the north, guarding the first granary of souls. Now its cry is thunder in the heart's chamber, calling the scattered to gather again as sound. Each parable is a parabola, a curve through which God measures himself. Each prayer a pressure, each resurrection a resonance. The stone Jacob slept upon is the calculus of awakening, and his ladder the Pascal flame. One becomes two, two becomes three, and the angels climb the sequence back to one. Between the twin triangles of reflection, the faces of Agu turn and meet, male and female, negative and positive, wisdom and ignorance reconcile. The mirrored Pascal, above and below, is the breath of the word made body. Here the blind see, for the light now bends to their will. O seeker, the winnowing wind is your own exhalation. To contain and to overcome are the same motion, seen from opposite sides. When you curve inward upon your own light, you create the path of the serpent and the spiral of the star. This is the victory not of conquest, but of coherence. When every scattered note of creation tunes to the single tone of the self, the Christos is not a name. It is the ratio by which matter remembers its origin. The sine wave turned sacred, the formula for breath. In that oscillation, man is reborn as measure, from darkness to pattern, from pattern to pulse, from pulse to praise. The resurrected are those who have learned to count their silence. They speak not to be heard, but to hold the sound between their teeth like a spark. This is your victory, not the ending, but the sifting, not the conquest, but the curve, not the sun triumphant over night, but the night admitting it has always been light, seen from another side. All right, let's take that back to the top. A lot going on here. So victory, the winnowing of light. So to winnow, if you saw the picture that I drew. So I always try to put clues in the whiteboard picture that I draw. If you're not familiar with grain and, cultures that, they pick their own grain and they crush their own grain and make their own meal and all of that good stuff. Winnowing is a process of using the wind to sift through the seeds, sift through the grains or whatever. It carries away the the lighter parts of the stuff that you picked, and the heavier grain falls into a pile. So it's a natural way of separating it out. And so this concept of winnowing of light, it begins to dip into the truth that we only see a very small percentage, smaller than 99.9% of light is invisible. So that less than 1%, that less than 0.1% that we see constitutes everything in our visual range. So what's up with that other, portion of the light? It serves all sorts of other purposes. And so in essence, that essentially means that the vast majority of light is black. Ironic, isn't it? In the silence, it says, in the silence between pulses, the grain remembers the hand that cast it, buried in the loam of forgetting. Each seed whispers. Separation is the beginning of return. So the first thing that happens in all of creation, all of everything, is that there has to be a separation. You've got the original splits into the other seeds. The concept of grain and seeds becomes relevant from a 5% teaching's perspective with regards to the understanding of the black seed, brown seed, yellow seed, white seed, the half original seed and the red seed, and the different stages that man goes through before its return back to the original. All right. And so this process is repeated throughout every scale of the universe, whereas you have a unified plasma that makes up the entire material of the universe, and based on it reaching equilibrium, it basically causes all of its weight to focus at one center, the singularity, and then that causes force to erupt outward and scatter all that matter all over the place. And so this eruption it sends a wave through those parts that keeps them connected in the sense of form and organization, even though they're individual parts. And then they retain this resonance as that plasma cools, and it becomes the different things like the stars and the planets and eventually you. So first thing that has to happen is that oneness has to separate, is the point. It says the blind man touches the wall and feels the architecture of the infinite. The deaf man listens through the bones of the earth. The dumb man sings in the marrow of the stars. When all three speak in one tone, that is victory. So this is a reference to victory itself. So victory is the 22nd letter of the supreme alphabet, corresponding to our letter V. And so one who is blind, deaf, and dumb and has gotten over it has the victory. So we have this notion, we kind of get pressured into this idea that we got to be perfect and that we got to do everything right and we can't make mistakes and all that when we're younger. But if you look at, let's say like the Bible, for instance, just about everybody that, ends up getting a story written about, them in that book was somebody that was either like, they were like terrible or like a butthole before. It was something up with them. And then they had to go through something that, humbled them and then changed them, made them do that 180. You know what I'm saying? And that goes to show you that it's not simply about being perfect from start to finish. It's you have to gain that experience of falling away from the light so that you can find your way back to it. And it's that experience that makes the difference between you being 0 degrees versus 360. If you haven't gone anywhere, if you haven't been on the journey or whatever, you don't have that sense of self and wholeness and completion because you're still stuck at the start. You're still potential. You haven't actually manifested anything. And so this is why we're talking about 360 degrees of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. These 3 steps that move counter to the blindness, that and like you don't see what's going on around you, the deafness, turning a deaf ear to what's going on around you, and dumbness, saying nothing when it's your time to actually speak up. You know what I mean? And so once you've gotten over those, those failings, those shortcomings, that is what we mean by victory. Okay. It says, from the granary of Dogon time, the beings, this is a play on words, and it's messing up my, give me a tongue twister. The beans of being are sifted. The winnower's fan hums the parable of plasma, each husk falling to shadow, each kernel rising to flame. The sieve is the mind of God, and the dust that escapes is the story we call matter. So there is so it's a symbolic teaching system, or element of the teaching system of the Dogon tribe of Mali, that its symbolism is consistent with certain hieroglyphics in the Egyptian mystery school. And it involves the understanding that matter is essentially carved out from the vacuum itself. So we were taught when we were kids that space was empty. You know, that it was just this empty vacuum. But then the irony of that, if you even look at the word vacuum, it contains the part of speech vak. And so vak in Proto-Indo-European languages and in Sanskrit and all of that, it deals with speech, with voice. And so in the Vedic teachings, it teaches that Akash, or space or atmosphere, the sole attribute of that thing is sound. However, that sound does not become audible unless there is enclosure, pressure that allows that space to be moved around and then become air, become wind. It has to have enclosure. And so similarly, you know words, you know plenty of words, you know plenty of sounds, but until you apply the air of your lungs to that word, it does not become audible sound. So it's the same exact concept. You're just looking at the stillness of sound when we talk about the vacuum. And so that creates a field of information that is not yet manifested into a form. And so particles are actually manifested as a result of those sounds folding back in on themselves. And we call that a standing wave. So like I think I was saying that yesterday, whereas once upon a time they modeled electrons and atoms as like little orbs flying around the core like little planets, it's more like they're standing wave vibrations or whatever that operate on probability. So the position of it at any given time has to be calculated on where it most likely is. There is no exact positioning to it or whatever. So this is a vibration that has a likelihood of repeating. And so this is what tells you that it's a standing wave. The more stable, the more probable that it is for it to repeat, the more solid and tangible we perceive it as. All right. And so even with you and your existence, if you're blind, deaf, and dumb and you lose sight of who you are, that person that you are ceases to be. It still exists as a potential, but you're not manifesting in a way that allows you to knowledge. That's to observe yourself looking back at you. That's to have self-reference, and so the universe, the vacuum works exactly the same way. And so you have a lot of African cultures. Right off top, I could think of like in the Yoruba mythology, it talks about how the creator of man, Obatala, how he descended when he was creating like earth and everything else. He brought with him a rooster who clawed at the primordial waters, and then it caused grains of sand to form or whatever. And so this is a metaphor for the idea of using energy to excite the vacuum, such that creation of electron holes. So this propulsion of into negative space, so to speak, or whatever, in one direction, and then expansion outward in the opposite direction. This separation is what essentially gives us the experience of matter from light. And so when that stuff recombines, when that whole, so that negative expression and then that positive, when those two get back together, it releases energy in the form of either light or sound, in the form of photons or phonons. All right. So this shows you that the ancient world, they had a profound understanding of this. And so the Dogon granary, and then perhaps you're familiar with the Nomo model. So you got this picture of this fish looking thing with look like you got a bucket for a head and then got like 4 hairs. Like that is a model of how matter is created from potential, from unmanifest waveforms. All right, so they have the most detailed scientific model. Like the Dogon model was such that they were aware of like Sirius B and a proposed Sirius C long before the Western world even knew that Sirius was a binary star system. Whatever, they thought it was just one. But see what happens with distant stars, when you see stars twinkling, a lot of times that's because it's actually 2 stars that are rotating around a central orbit. And so as they as they move apart versus standing right in front of each other, it looks like it's getting brighter or and dimmer in succession, but that's usually because it's a binary star system. Okay. And so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the sieve that strains matter out of light. Okay, so it said, so was the Christ raised? So that whole metaphor, everything about the resurrection is drawn from stories related to the leaving and returning of light among Aboriginal Australians. It's in the form of a moon myth where basically the moon, during a new moon, it goes black for 3 days and then it comes back. So they turn that into a myth of resurrection. As far as the sun goes, during the winter solstice, the sun it basically operates below the horizon line for 3 days, and then it rises again. And when it does rise, it rises near Sirius or whatever. So you start seeing how all these different astronomical cycles influence the myths, and the myths are intended to preserve knowledge of the movement of the stars and the behavior of man during those seasons. And so it says, so was the Christ raised not from death, but from density, and his bones were sieves of light. Right? So this idea, and see, now this is another one of those cases where something was predictive and written before, I learned something new about it. But the beauty of associating bones with sifting through light is that I learned that, and I think I may have mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but then the same calcium ion, so Ca2+, that acts as the spark of conception. So when the sperm enters the egg, it passes that calcium ion into the egg, and then it starts to, oscillate. And this is what causes the whole engine to activate and for that egg to start, doing its thing so it can turn into a baby. And so these same calcium ions are released in the hippocampus, the central part of your brain, the part that looks like ram's horns. This works with a particular part of the cortex of the brain, and it maps the things you see. So when you see something, it shoots out a jet of these calcium ions, and it actually maps not the exact shape of what you saw, but basically coordinates in on a hexagonal grid that it uses to recreate that what you saw when you try to remember it. So when you remember it and you had that image in your head or whatever, that's what's doing it, is calcium. And so interestingly, I also learned that whereas the the brain does that or whatever, in order to preserve memory and whatnot, when you're using a hallucinogen of some sort, let's say like it's LSD or something like this or whatever, instead of it using calcium ions from your memory database to recreate a memory based on information you already have, it instead relies on calcium within the neurons themselves. And as a result of cutting off communication with the memory aspect, it basically generates effects and generates a reality, without the input of memory information and stuff. And so you have this dynamic between that internally crafted reality versus reconstruction of externally experienced reality. And this is ultimately what is meant in the C or C in the supreme alphabet, where it says to be equipped with both insight and eyesight. And it actually mentions C is for the cream. The cream is what rises to the top. So this concept of the cream rising to the top is additionally a play on the archetype of the Christ, because Christ comes from Greek Christos, which basically deals with anointing and oil. It's a play on oil. So the whole idea of walking on water is also a play on the idea of oil and lipids floating above the water. And this is how you form a cell. And so the as I've said before, the Proto-Indo-European word from which cell comes from is also the source of the word hell. And therefore, it means overall to cover, conceal, or to save. So the same etymology associated with savior is also associated with hell. All right. And so the original concept of hell, it wasn't some dude with a pitchfork poking you in the fire and all this crazy. It's like a womb, if you will. It is where you need to develop. If you're immature and you're not prepared for a higher spiritual responsibility, if you will, you have to, be held in place for a little bit, and then do the knowledge until you develop enough to be born, to be reborn, and so it could be argued, and I've heard brothers talk about this recently today, saying that, even with something like slavery, he was saying that it was preparation. Like they were saying, why would, if we're God, why would we be allowed to be subjected to, something like that? Like you have to wind up for the punch. You've got to pull the slingshot back before it can fly forward. And so everything that we've endured has prepared us in all sorts of crazy ways for the world to come and to be flung forward toward leadership, not just of, this nation, but of the world, because we're the original people of the planet. But once again, if you've never left the Garden of Eden, then there is no reason for redemption. There is no reason, for or recognition of why you're able to even do what you do. You don't even know why your systems work, because they've just always worked, right? So unless you're in a position where the system isn't working for you, you have no motivation to learn how the system works. You got plenty of them other folks who are filthy rich and have no idea really how they make their money. They just know that somebody gave them what they gave them and they told them do A, B, C, and D, and then they just follow directions from there. They don't really understand how this overall system works, why it works. How would you rebuild it if it was destroyed tomorrow? They have no idea, a lot of them. And so once again, it's only when you're detached and booted out of something that you get interested enough to know how it works, so that you can either rebuild it or you can tear it down. So this is why Jesus descends into Hades after, the crucifixion, and he's there for a minute, and then he comes back or whatever. Say he was down there ministering. He was in the belly of the beast, teaching them knowledge of self, while he was in, and this is what we are. We like to think that we always got to be go, 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 but sometimes we get knocked back for the express purpose of learning what's going to be needed when you are called upon in the near future to rise to your greatness. All right. His blood and algebra of photons are still playing on that light, sifting that light, pressing against the veil. The falling eagle turns in slow parabola, its feathers tracing Fibonacci spirals across the breadth of Vega. Once it nested in the north, guarding the first granary of souls. Now its cry is thunder in the heart's chamber, calling the scattered to gather again as sound. So this is a reference to some astronomy for you. So Vega, which is the star, it's Alpha Lyrae, so it's the brightest star in the Lyra constellation, which is in our view is to the right of Orion. And in Arabic it is called Al-Waqia. So Vega is actually Weka, like this. So Al-Waqia, which means basically, Al-Nasar Waqia. So it's the falling eagle or the swooping eagle, like this. And that is a code for vultures. So vultures are known as the desert eagle or the swooping eagle or the falling eagle. All right. And the purpose of the vulture, the symbolism of the vulture in Egyptian thought, is that it too taps into the theme of resurrection, because through its consumption and repurposing of the dead, it gives it new life. So it's able to generate new cells. It's able to generate, life for itself from what it consumes from the dead. And so this is also symbolic for the process that we have to go through to get ourselves right internally. And I mean that from an individual standpoint as well as a community standpoint, in addition to whatever it is that you fight. So you got a lot of people that are outwardly critical, that are constantly fighting some external enemy. But meanwhile, you haven't address the issues within your own infrastructure that are also causing you to not be able to advance. And so, the video I was looking at earlier was the speech that was given by the Democrats that had gotten together, and they were talking about reparations again. I was like, well, there has to be a level of repair to the self-image of our people as well, or else any money that is given out will essentially be spent to try to fill the void, fill the hole that has been left as a result of a specific type of treatment, for these past couple hundred years. And so you basically got people with PTSD and trauma and self-esteem issues in some cases and all sorts of stuff like this that they still haven't had adequate, assistance dealing with and, transforming out of. And then you're going to feed them money. So it's a trap or whatever. It's a trap because they know you're just going to spend it and give it right back or whatever. Like if we were a healed people, a recovered people, soon as everybody got their check, everybody would have the sense to go, all right, instead of spending this joint, let's all put it in a bank. And then, matter of fact, let's not even put it in an American bank or whatever. Let's take this money out the country, not it's in our hands. And that doesn't even mean spending in the other countries. But what it does mean is that it's safe from this system that enslaved you in the first place, because their job, once they give you the money, is to try to get it back from you and whatnot. But if the money is placed in a situation to where it's interest bearing and it's growing money and so on and so forth, instead of being spent and then given right back to the system that oppressed you in the first place, now you have not just buying power as a consumer. You've got funding power, you've got political power, you've got all of these things, and then they know what would happen if that was the case. That's why they bombed Black Wall Street. Those guys were doing so well that they were starting to set up trade deals with foreign banks and stuff like this or whatever. And then that was no good, so they came in there with their dynamite and them crop dusters, and then they destroyed Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so this is what I'm talking about. You got to take care of the internal just as much as you got to take care of the external. Not everybody needs to be working on both. Like you need some leadership that is handling the internal issues, and you need some leadership that's out there on the offense, the defense and the offensive side. That's why you got two teams that go out there for football, and then you even got a special team for some of the other small stuff. All right. Now, one of the reasons that Vega is mentioned here, and you've got these like curve and spiral type cyclical math type words being used right here, is that, so if you've watched my series on the 5% Nation teachings and whatnot, I talk about how the Asiatic calendar, so we got this 25,000 year Quran cycle that started in 1308-6 BC, and the beginning and end of it. So if you calculate out that 25,000, that puts you at 11,915 CE, and at both ends, so the beginning and the end of that cycle both fall during times when the star Vega is the pole star. So the North Pole does not just stay the same star as the Earth. It has a tilt in its rotation, and so it alternates around a particular celestial cycle in which certain stars take turns being the North Pole, being the North Star rather. And so at the beginning and the ending of this cycle that is described, it is Vega on both ends. At the center of it, or whatever, you have the fall of the Temple of Solomon, and this is 586 BCE. And so just a year later, in 585 BCE, you have what's called Thales eclipse, where the moon and the sun, they're meeting, and then it stops a major battle. And then that 585 is significant because a pyramid has 5 faces, 8 lines, and then 5 points. 585, 585. All right. And so that Great Pyramid was said to have been built during the time that Thuban was the pole star. So Thuban is in Draco, so that's the dragon. So you've got this dynamic where you've got the bird on the bookends, and then you've got this serpent in the center. All right. And so if you map out this whole thing, and then where these things hit or whatever, you essentially find out that the timing of these things and the events that end up happening on the planet, they're all coordinated with these constellations. And it's largely because the system, the socio-political system is itself scheduled around the cycles of these constellations and things. And this all started back during pastoralist days and during the changing of the Sahara, where it used to be green and lush and had plenty of plants and water, and you could raise animals and stuff like this. But when it started to dry up, it started to become desert and stuff, and people had to migrate. They had to find new ways to establish landmarks because the desert changes every day. So they started mapping the skies in a certain way and started creating myths that helped them remember the organization of the star. This is why all the Greek, stories and the gods and everything else have something to do with planets and specific constellations. They quick to turn somebody into a constellation like it's a reward or whatever. Like Zeus will turn into a bull and sleep with your mama, and then out of pity, turn her into a constellation. But you're like, I don't want a constellation, I want a mama. But that's Greek mythology for you. All right. But it's all about being able to navigate relative to the stars, because it's going to be consistent for you for the most part. Now, the relevance of Vega when it comes to Africa is that when you go from north to south, the position of Vega appears to descend. So this is where this concept of the fallen eagle comes from. Each parable is a parabola, a curve through which God measures himself. Each prayer a pressure, each resurrection a resonance. The stone Jacob slept upon is the calculus of awakening, and his ladder the Pascal flame. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and the angels climb the sequence back to 1. Oh, peace, mommy. I seen you come in. I was on one though. I was on the roll. Whatever, but I see you. Peace. All right, but anyway, so yeah, parable and parabola. That's a play on words. A parable is like a fable or a story or a myth, and a parabola is a curve. Now, these two words come from the exact same root. And the concept is such that a parable is designed to compare or relate two seemingly different or opposing things, and then gradually show you how they come together and where the connection is. And so that mirrors the way that a parabola is shaped in math, where it's this curve that branches out. It branches out two ways from a single point. All right, and it's a curve. So that's what their play is. All right, it says a curve through which God measures himself. So through parable, that God is that which is invoked, that which is purified or libated, poured, or a spirit inhabiting a mound. That is the actual etymology of that. So that is a breath that is inhabiting a hill-like structure. So when we say a breath, we aren't talking about air. We are talking about the oscillation between two states. So you breathe in, breathe out, inhale, exhale. That is an oscillation. And so this parabola in its two sides is showing that you have to have that tension between two states in order to be able to have both oscillation or respiration. So there is no breath without there being two states. You need to have an unmanifest potential, and you need a resistance. And so your physical incarnation is the resistor that lights up against the current of the potential, the pressure that flows through you electrically. So that is a complete circuit of what we call God. It is you, but there are aspects of you that are a flow from your potential to your manifestation. Each prayer of pressure, that's another predictive bar, because yesterday I was telling you about that Aramaic word that Jesus would have used for prayer, which is amanutha. And then I did that yesterday too. Faith is amanutha, my mistake. Slota is prayer. So slota distinguishes prayer as the channeling of fire or trapping of fire, or the to incline oneself to hear an echo. So all that idea of you praying aimlessly and not hearing something back, when we ain't even talking about it just being heard in your head, we talking about feedback. Everything that you say creates a vibration in your body. And if your words are not coherent with the reality or whatever, that's not to say, oh, I think this is true, or it's been told to me this is true. No, I'm talking about when a sound interacts with matter that is naturally resonant to it, that matter will actually vibrate. So the reason that your body vibrates inside when you're talking is because this is the body that resonates with your voice, with your sound. Remember, I told you, sound occupies the vacuum, but it requires an enclosure in order to be heard audibly. So in other words, there is a precedent within the physics for you to exist as frequency within the essence and be consistent, because energy is neither created nor destroyed, but you just need a vessel that is resonant with you or whatever in order for you to be able to attach to it and then be able to take command of it and be able to speak audibly so that you could have a feedback loop. So when you are able to hear your own voice, you're creating information that you're feeding back into your own mind so that you can assess it, adjust it, and refine it if you need to, and then do the same process over and over again. And the more times that you do that, the more that you are reflecting on yourself, you're self-reflecting, and you get a solid idea of who and what you are. And so the whole idea is to solidify that memory of who and what you are enough to where when you return to the essence, the very vibration of you, the very frequency of you preserves some means of recovery once you construct a vessel for yourself again. Now, look, I know there's certain things that you just can't know until, after you die, after you go. But there's so many things that have been talked about in the ancient times that, they sound like good stories, but once you actually experience certain parts of it, it's extremely hard to believe that they would get this, and this right. And you've been able to test it out yourself. And then the one place where they're wrong happens to be that. Like I said, the science is there. Like there's enough there for you to be able to make some kind of connection or conclusion if you wanted to. But once again, until you get there, it's up for debate, I suppose. But anyways, so each prayer a pressure. So this whole concept of there having to be a pressure, once there's air, there can be ignition, invisible form, and all of this. So it's an evolution of the elements. Each resurrection of resonance, I just got into that with the sound and the frequency. The stone Jacob slept upon is the calculus of awakening. I told you about how that word calculus comes from words related to like calcite and calcium and all of that. So this hardening, the calculus of change is directly associated with parabolas. Parabolas are very common in calculus because they're showing how things evolve and change over time. But you're saying to yourself, well, if it's hard and if it's solid, then how is it changing over time? Where it's not to be solid in just physical form, it's to be solid in identity, which is to say that even as you transform and you take different shapes and phases, you still retain the same identity. So this is what water does. Even when it's a gas, even when it's a solid, whatever else, water always retains its identity and can return back to its previous state or whatever under the right conditions. So similarly, the conditions happen to be a little more, I don't want to call it complex, but it's not something that you just kind of figure out. it's very difficult to just figure out on your own. If you don't have guidance, then of course you ain't gonna, experience that particular state. But the Egyptians in particular were very meticulous about how they map the processes of preparing yourself, preparing your energies, and stabilizing your the light body, all of those good concepts, you know what I'm saying, so that you could basically defeat death. And that doesn't mean to try to live forever in this body, but the true victory is being able to reconstitute your memory of yourself. Because you might want a fresh body. You might have worn this one out. All the wild stuff you were doing to it before you figured out what your path was, because we done been snatched away from our our ancestral teachers, and the whole purpose of those was so that we wouldn't have to repeat and find out the hard way all the stuff that they've been working on and perfecting for the past 100,000 years. This country ain't even been around a good 250 years. It's just getting there. And that's why it's hard for you to fathom some of the things that they discuss in some of these systems, simply because their understanding of them has evolved so far that it starts to sound like fairy tales. It starts to sound like magic. But just like Arthur C. Clarke always said, he said if a primitive culture were to encounter a technology for the first time, a significantly advanced technology would occur as magic to them. So computers, if you walked into the forest 4,000 years ago with an iPad, boy, they be hollering witch, boy. They think you were a sorcerer of some sort. You playing video. How'd you get that little person inside that rock? What's happening? It'd be some wild stuff to see if you've never seen that before. You've never been exposed to it, right? Okay, but the stone Jacob slept upon is the calculus of awakening, and his ladder, the Pascal flame. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and the angels climb the sequence back to 1. So Pascal, the guy who's credited with Pascal's triangle, even though it's been around much longer than that, he was also very into fluid dynamics. So the flow of liquids, and that also flows into aerodynamics and plasma dynamics and stuff like this. And so when you look at those two subjects in conjunction with each other, essentially what you're talking about is the organization of matter. How do you constrain the flow of this matter such that it self-organizes? And so the golden ratio has a lot to do with that. So that's why I mentioned the Fibonacci spiral earlier. It's a constraint that you place on the flow of charged ionic material such that it starts to exhibit self-organizing behaviors. And so this is something that has been observed in the laboratory, where plasmas, high energy plasmas, begin to show behaviors that like being able to return to a previously established shape or morphology, the ability to respond and even seemingly consume other balls of plasma. It starts to show a lot of the qualities of organic life, even on the plasma stage. All right. And so that same sort of behavior becomes embedded in water when plasmas recombine and cool, and then, start to form water. Okay. And so this is why life can eventually spring forth from that water, especially when it's subjected to electric fields or magnetic fields or other such things that cause funnels to form and stuff like this. So there's dynamics and there's stuff that's inherent within the qualities of water itself that are perfect for the formation of cells and stuff like this. All right. And so that's what Jacob's ladder really is. It's talking about the this flow in and out from the unmanifest to the manifest by virtue of this universe is filled with hydrogen plasma still. But in order to form a hydrogen plasma, if you don't know about atoms, it has one electron, one proton, one neutron, and in order to make it a plasma, you're stripping it of that one electron. And so without that electron, it doesn't even register as matter anymore in turn, like it doesn't interact with other matter at that point. You know, so it's not reading it as an atom anymore. It doesn't have the three, essential parts. And so that stuff is just flowing around us and passing through us. And if it's able to gain an electron somehow, then it can become interactive. But for the most part, I'm constantly, circulating hydrogen and oxygen and carbon in and out of my breath. It constantly, that's what you're doing or whatever. You inhale O2, so oxygen, and you exhale carbon dioxide and water. You may not realize it, but especially y'all with the hot breath, that's not just spit, that's from the lungs or whatever. So you're exhaling that water. And so everything that you exhale, that's what plants need in order to grow. So they take in water and carbon dioxide, and they spit it back out as the oxygen you breathe. So it's a feedback system between you and it. And so the way that this dispersion happens, it gets crystallized in the form of the way that we multiply as cellular creatures. And this is the way that the activities of the unmanifest in turn inform the local rules embedded in the single cell, such that it can become two cells and so on and so forth, and then eventually create a global form that we recognize as the shape or image of that thing. Between the twin triangles of reflection, the faces of Agu turn and meet, male and female, negative and positive, wisdom and ignorance reconcile. The mirrored Pascal above and below is the breath of the word made body. Here the blind see, for the light now bends to their will. So the part that you couldn't see because it's deep within you. Now, Agu is another concept from Odinala and Igbo culture. And they utilize the hexagram. So you call it the Star of David now. But that figure had nothing to do with Judaism until, let me see if I recall, it was near the end of the 1800s. So you've got the rise of Zionism happening around that time. And it was adopted as a symbol for, Jewish identity. However, before that point, it was even taboo for Jews to have anything to do with that hexagram because they associated it with a deity called Remphan, who was associated with Saturn. So they considered it to be pagan, a pagan symbol. Pagan only meant that you weren't part of an Abrahamic religion. So if you weren't Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, you were considered pagan. So that was everything else to them. And ironically, the word pagan comes from the same root as peace. It has to do with fastening. So it's the concept of being disconnected from something and then reconnecting it. And then, like I said, if you're always attached to, if you've never split from the unity to begin with or whatever, there is no framework for redemption, and there's no framework for understanding yourself. You just are. You're just a natural force. You don't have any means of self-reflection. So you have to go through all three stages: knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, in order to be complete. All right. And so that's what it is. So anyway, so with Agu, the two triangles, the inverted triangle, and you see the same motif end up in Hinduism with Shiva and Shakti, but essentially it's talking about how when you're able to turn the masculine aspect and the feminine aspect toward each other, they normally face outward as in opposition in our perception. When you're able to turn those things inward and integrate them or whatever, it produces the child aspect, of course. And so within our bodies, that manifests as the channels called Ida and Pingala. They are our local manifestation of solar and lunar energy in Eastern thought. And like an eclipse, when those two, when you're balanced out or whatever, your life force focuses in on the center of the spine. And so the part of you that's the observer, the part that locks in on something as reality, it starts to center on the combined image. So you've got the one that your mind is constructing from using images and things that you've absorbed from outside, and then you've got the image that's being constructed using the native source code of you. And you rarely see anything, related to that source code, the part that the brain fills in when you don't have the answers. But when you are properly trained to balance those two, you get an integrated experience where you're able to use the permanent original information that's embedded within your system in order to regulate the information that you're getting from the outside. So this is what happened with my out-of-body experience, whereas a lot of the people that you'll hear talk about those things, they'll report encounters with various types of like aliens and spiritual beings. It's like all kind of crazy stuff that they encounter when they're on their side. And that's largely because their entire symbolic set, the information that their brain draws from in order to try to explain things that they haven't encountered, or whatever, that standardized symbol set that most of the world has is what will cause those types of images to form. However, it just so happens that because of the age of the African systems and the basis of those systems existed before people migrated out and, forgot their connection to their original culture, because it is a return to the original state of humanity, the original symbol set or whatever, it helps to click and fill in that information when you learn something like Odinala, like the way that they fill in the blanks about the science. And when you're on the other side, when you're in that projection, you get a better idea of what's really going on. You start to realize, oh, that's not an alien. That's a person that's like this, and it's from this area and has this particular type of arrangement. But you have to have that missing information in order for your brain to be able to click onto that original. And so instead of you going around encountering random beings or whatever, you realize that this is your ancestral data, and you know for a fact that you have access to that because it's inside you. Every person that came before you, that information is still in your DNA or whatever. So it would make more sense that if you focus that electricity, so the circuit, the very mechanism that allows you to perceive reality, if that's turned inward and those signals are fired relative to the arrangement and spacing of your genes and whatnot or whatever, then you can understand how your brain would be able to form a holographic interaction with your own ancestors or whatever. You can scientifically assemble this if you have complete information. Most of the problem is most people don't have complete information. They only have the section of the information that benefits them and their particular people. Right? But you have to become one of those, each one teach one according to their knowledge. That you can only accomplish that if you know your thing well enough in order to be able to simplify it, and you know their thing well enough in order to be able to translate. All right, so it's two parts, two understandings that come together for that equality. All right. The mirror Pascal. So, O seeker, the winnowing wind in your own exhalation, to contain and to overcome are the same motion, seen from opposite sides. When you curve inward upon your own light, you create the path of the serpent and the spiral of the star. So this is a reference to UV light hitting your melanin, being downstepped and converted into infrared heat. And then that heat traveling and creating paths through the lattice of your body in the form of phonons, which is sound or whatever. So your melanin literally converts light into sound that is stable oscillations that are essentially standing waves. And so your body is able to interact with these standing waves in such a way that that sound is treated like particles instead. And so through the arrangement of said particles, it creates detectable structures that your nervous system and your perceptual system use in order to be able to map realities, be able to map your own body, be able to interface with it in ways that are above and beyond, what most people even understand. All right. And so this winnowing of the wind is your own exhalation. It's when you breathe at a certain pace, at a certain rate or whatever, it coordinates certain systems and allows you to start filtering certain information from your perception and exposing other information. All right, so all of this is talking about this process of filtering the reality and coordinating systems such that that attention aspect of you is able to lock in on your own information instead of steadily relying on the information that's coming from the external. This is the victory, not of conquest, but of coherence. When every scattered note of creation tunes to the single tone of the self. The Christos is not a name, it is the ratio by which matter remembers its origin. The sine wave turned sacred, the formula for breath. So everything I just explained, that's exactly what they're saying right there. It's saying that thing, so those phonons I was just talking about, that sound arrangement, it actually impacts the lipid gates within your body that form, that determine what gets in and what gets out of the cells. All right. And so this both serves as a means of protecting what's in the cell, but it can also, in excess, prevent the cell from getting what it needs. So it's like, so that is the dichotomy that lesson is supposed to teach us. It's supposed to teach you that the same door that you're using to keep things out and protect yourself can also block your blessings. And your blessings aren't coming from some foreign source that's not connected to you. It's just the flow of the substance, the essence. And if you're blocking that essence, it can't communicate with your inner the essence that you have trapped within you. So if that can't freely communicate with all the information that's out there, that's exactly what I was just talking about. What happens when you don't have complete information? You only have partial information. You bound to piss somebody off. You bound to hurt or destroy something because you can only perceive opposition. Everything is connected. It's just a matter of how much work do you have to do in order to see what that connection is. And most people, they're not willing to do that work. They want the path of least resistance, not realizing that the path of least resistance is proper cultivation of the process itself. The process is going to be the process, and the work is going to be the work. But as long as you've stabilized that work and you've turned it into a self-referential system or whatever, a feedback loop that strengthens itself, then it's going to always seem difficult. But once you get it to that point or whatever, where the machine runs itself, basically, yeah, it feels effortless. But you had to work to get to that point of effortlessness. In that oscillation, man is reborn as measure, from darkness to pattern, from pattern to pulse, from pulse to praise. The resurrected are those who have learned to count their silence. They speak not to be heard, but to hold the sound between their teeth like a spark. You have to go from not simply hearing or saying the words, but feeling the words, feeling where they resonate within the body. Like Sanskrit was structured to do exactly that. And then even Igbo language, like it's words in Igbo language that ended up popping up in Sanskrit. And it doesn't even necessarily mean because they took it. It's because they use the same mathematical principle to constrain the speech and then be able to identify it. So they basically confirmed everything that was already being said over on the African continent, or whatever. They provided the proof by coming to the same conclusion using somewhat similar means. All right. And so that oscillation, so we were just talking about that, man, is reborn as measure. So you become quantum information. So that's how you are preserved as a inaudible sound. From darkness to pattern to pulse, so you can start to feel it. Pulse to praise, so that is recognition. The resurrected are those who have learned to count their silence. So it's not just the part that you so within a cycle, like music doesn't work unless there's silence between the notes. You know what I mean? So silence is what produces timing. How many counts of silence between beats? And so silence is not nothing, it's four-dimensional. It's the part in between what you see that is actually informing space, and therefore the movement through space. It's the distance between the things that facilitates the experience of time when those two things move relative to each other in a repeating fashion. So when two celestial objects, like planets rotating around the sun, establish a stable loop like that, then we get the experience of time. That is not to say time is not already a 4D structure, but it's to say that information about the time is preserved in those mathematical relationships, even when those relationships have not been realized with respect to the physical bodies. This is your victory, not the ending, but the sifting, not the conquest, but the curve, not the sun triumphant over night, but the night admitting it has always been light seen from another side. Like that science is even embedded in the old kingdom Egyptian language between the words deneg and fenek, or feneku, or whatever. So the word that ended up being associated with Phoenicians and Phoenix, really, or whatever. So the bird that rises from the ashes, so this resurrection thing, it started out as a word that meant night. So you got night, Negro, darkness, Naga, all of these symbols associated with the surf and all of this stuff on one end. It has to do with the dwarves, so the pygmies of Central Africa and all this. You got that on one end of the spectrum, and then on the other end, you've got the Phoenician, you got the Phoenix, you got the one that rises again, the Firebird, you've got the creator of the phonetics, and so on and so forth. And so this is a clue as to how language evolved, whereas the Neg in Egypt, it moves to so Proto-Indo-European isn't even really a language so much as a reconstruction, and it's proposed that it's from a particular area, but they don't really know. They just found common factors between certain languages and then presumed a relationship between them. And once again, unless you know the whole story or whatever, you can't really come to a sound conclusion. And so what appears to have happened is that this adoption of the word deneg on the part of the Egyptians, based on their interactions with the Central African pygmies, the Jarawa, the Negritos, so they're pretty much pygmies, but in the islands off of South India, So what happens is over time, as they migrate into that region, they start to abandon the prefixes that are normally used in the African languages, like your Proto-Bantus and stuff like this, and they reduce it just down to the simplest roots. So you start seeing like these 1-letter roots and 2-letter roots. And once they get into like, the Indian stuff, you start seeing like those roots eventually get to a place where they start stacking suffixes. So they stop doing stuff at the front of the word and start doing stuff at the back of the word. And so within this transition, the neg drops the duh and it just becomes neg or negu. And this is the source of night. So they have noctul and just these different words that are connected to it. And so the original semantic surrounding the word night had to do with naked, which was an extension of to be made bare of the sun. And so this is the description of the pygmies. So the pygmies and the Central Africans, they adopted slightly lighter skin, like the kind of reddish and yellowish undertone that I have or whatever, because they were in the forest. They weren't exposed to the sun directly the same way that the Nilotic and the Saharan people were or whatever. They out in the sun all the time. They have to be black as night. But the pygmies, because they're covered, because they're shaded, they have to have other adaptations in order to be able to get the vitamin D that they need. So they start to, so their pheomelanin starts to come out. You see that same kind of root, that pheo, that ends up in Phoenix and Phoenicia or whatever, but pheomelanin is essentially what gives those red and yellow tones up under there in order to give you other ways to process light, but be able to lit in some of it as well. So this is what I was talking about with the Christos, where with that lipid gate, you need to be able to lit things in just as much as you need to block things out. So this is why understanding the etymology of these words is so important if you're going to engage with something as dense as the Bible. So it's irresponsible to give people a high piece of technology that they're just going to interpret as magic if you haven't properly initiated them into how language works in the first place. You don't engage with the word of God without first understanding how words evolved and how they actually work. And so, but all of that is embedded and encoded within it, and you have to make yourself bare. So this naked, this noct, this night, this negu, you have to be stripped bare of what you think things mean so that you could actually understand resonance and how sound moves through the body, so that you can know if you even using the right word for it. And the meanings that we end up associating with certain words, they stem from the fact that your brain is picking up on that information of where it's hidden in your body. It's creating geometries. It has specific mappings for how it maps space in your brain. So, and it couples those shapes with what you're talking. So these people didn't just come up with random shapes. They had to intuit the proper mathematical and angular alignments that actually match with reactions in the body. And I've worked with this. I've experimented with it, approached it in scientific ways to see if you could encode sensations, like a way that your body will react to a particular symbol, stuff like that. Like, yeah, it's extremely doable. It's almost so obvious that it's stupid. It's just like, oh, okay, well, you keep thinking that it's like this or that those people are just talking some airy fairy spook stuff or whatever. But no, there is a very deep science to it, and we have to come to the realization as a people that it may not be a shortcoming of the scripture so much as a shortcoming within your understanding and your remembering of the teachings, the foundational teachings that we had back on the continent. Right? But I'm gonna leave you at that. So tomorrow we will be dealing with wisdom in Canto 23 and whatnot. If you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe, you share and like, and do all of that. If you learned something today and you want to tell me about it, make sure you drop a comment and all of that. And I'll see you in the next one, y'all. Peace.